My name is Catherine Frobeck. I'm the McCulloch Professor of Political Science at Dalhousie University and a member of the McEachern Institute Research Committee, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's theme looks at the way scientific evidence is produced, communicated, and applied. The phrase evidence-based policymaking is so prevalent that we think it's self-evident, but policymaking during the COVID era has underscored how this is anything but straightforward. We have scientists disagreeing on what the evidence is actually telling us. We have the media presenting pharmaceutical press releases as accepted fact. We have governments taking completely different positions based on the same body of scientific evidence. And we have a public increasingly confused and wary about the information they receive. So today we have representatives from the scientific community, the media, and government to explain why evidence-based policymaking is such a complex task. How is academic research communicated? How is it used by policymakers? How are ambiguity and uncertainty addressed? And what's the role in covering all this? The discussion is not meant simply to be COVID related, though of course with present events, it would I think be difficult to avoid. This webinar will be 1 hour only from start to finish. And each speaker has been invited to talk for about 6 or 7 minutes, and we'll also have some time for discussion afterwards. We'll be monitoring all questions that come in throughout the presentations in the Q&A box. So to start things off, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Lisa Barrett. Lisa is an infectious diseases scientist with Nova Scotia Health, as well as an assistant professor in the Faculty of Medicine at Dalhousie. She's currently leading a study looking into the factors causing some long-term care residents to be severely affected by COVID-19. And she's also involved in the organization of the pop-up testing sites around the province. So Lisa, welcome.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be here. As you mentioned, I am an infectious disease physician, but I'm also a scientist and researcher who works in Nova Scotia. And many of my comments for today will be centered around COVID. And I think it's really interesting to watch how individual practitioners, people associated with healthcare, have gone from their everyday world to shifting a little more towards the interpretation of data in a public realm, as well as interacting with folks they may not have interacted with before at a policy level. So in general, I used to do a lot of talking and a lot of speaking around academic information. I was in fact at an academic meeting about March 6th, I believe. Yes, exactly March 6th. And I had just done a piece of media, March 6th, 2020, where I was at a hepatitis C meeting and we were talking with the national media about hepatitis C elimination, a different virus. And that was about the 4th time I had been interacting through the media and through TV with people about viruses and our potential for eliminating them. And suddenly I finished this little piece of media and I got a call back saying, hey, hi, can you talk about this pneumonia business that seems to be happening in China? And do you know anything about this? And can you give us some context on it? And that was March 6th, 2020, just before lunch in Montreal, before I flew back home for what would be, tragically, my last flight since then for a person who usually traveled about 260 days a year. So life changed, not just for the general public, but it also changed for people who look after people, who communicate, and how we do it. And I'll break this down into 4 different parts for me. There's the information part for me. It's the 4 I's. The information part, how we interpret information, how we interface that information or communicate it, and then what does that really mean in terms of influence and how is that different from before? So as a scientist, we take pieces of information and often pre-COVID, we would be looking at things, and I know Dr. Colombo is going to talk a little more about data interpretation, so I won't go too much down that road, but we would take information that was solidly in the data realm when we're talking about health, usually. And that means that it's information or pieces of knowledge that have been vetted in a certain way with a robust process. And we turn that into data. There was time for the information to mature, to be reviewed, to look at it. And suddenly with COVID, we're in a pandemic, and I like to call it pandemic standard time is the way we both generate, process, and disseminate information. And suddenly you didn't have that tried and true process. You were working as well as you could, as quickly as you could, to take pieces of information, validate them, and put them forward and interpret them. And I think back to Catherine's point, that interpretation is not unifocal or monofocus. What you have to do is interpret health information that's coming in either on a new virus, how it transmits, what it does, what disease does it cause, what impact does that have on people at a population level or a personal level. All these lenses have to come into the interpretation of how much weight you put onto this piece of information. It's not just quantitative anymore, it's qualitative. And then you're going to put that out there, hopefully as soon as you can, so that people in the public can gain some information for themselves. But providing information, obviously, without some context is not super helpful. And so that's where the interpretation, the interface comes in. You took all those lenses, you take a number, you take lenses and put it around this particular number or set of information that is now data. And then you rapidly interpret it in terms of what we think the public should do. Okay, that's great. How do you then get that out to people in a way that's in, again, pandemic standard time? People are sitting there at the beginning, the middle, and even now during this pandemic, there's a very urgent need among folks in the public, in governments, in healthcare providers, to know what to do. And there's a need to know information. And so that means this information goes out very quickly. How do you interface that? And my job has somehow become partially to look at new ways of a doctor, a clinician scientist who usually speaks mostly at conferences or to patients one-on-one, to take information and try to put that into an interface through communication that reaches more people. Doing that's been a bit of a ride, I would say. There have been folks who have not done this a lot. I certainly probably did 100 talks a year, and about 10% of those were community facing for the general public. But now you're trying to explain information and to find the right outlets to explain information that are different than usual. And in particular, we've gone through, I've been involved and many others have been involved with communication to people through media. And that's print, it's TV, it's social media in real time. How often and how much you do that differs by the person you are and what your style is. But the public's getting information all over the place, and clinicians, scientists, government folks are offering not just interpretation of the data, but also an opinion sometimes. And that has to happen to provide some input for people, I think. I've certainly done it. And the communication then has gone back to other realms. Sometimes most of my roles have come around to go into government after they've heard this information being disseminated to the public first and not to government or to academia first. So that's different. Sometimes the information's reaching the public right now before it reaches others within governments and academia, which is a little bit of a difference these days. Is that good or bad? I'm not sure. I'd love to hear what comes of the panel as we go along, but I'd like to pitch that out as a question. It's real, it's present. And I think then that comes to my last I. So we've gone through information, interpretation, and the interface or communication. But then how do you turn this into something that influences what happens in healthcare? And how do you do that? And certainly then do you become part of ad hoc committees? Do you get an official role in doing some of this? I think there's been many jobs, many ways that information's been disseminated in healthcare during this pandemic. That's a microcosm for how we might think about using information, experts, and data differently, quickly, to not only inform, but to influence. And so I think that's about where I wanted to stop, bring up my eyes, the information, interpretation, interface, and influence, and love to hear what other people think, and happy to take questions at the end.
Many thanks, Lisa. Great. So our second panelist is Stephanie Colombo, who's an assistant professor and Canada Research Chair in Aquaculture Nutrition at Dalhousie. She has a special interest in healthy, environmentally sustainable, economically viable farmed seafood. So go ahead, Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be part of this really interesting panel. So my research is on aquaculture, and despite it being a very important part of Canadian and global agriculture, it's a pretty contentious topic, and there's a lot of misinformation spread, especially on social media. A lot of the misinformation that I read has to do with consumption of farmed fish and shellfish. You know, it's bad for you, it's full of contaminants, it's full of antibiotics, the negative impacts on the environment, etc., which are not based on scientific evidence and are simply not true. There's also some mixed messaging from different leaders at various levels of government sometimes regarding positive and negative impacts of aquaculture. And sometimes quick decisions are made that are not necessarily science-based, but are more societal driven than anything else. So obviously there's a strong role that science needs to play in policy, but sometimes it doesn't always make it to that point, which is interesting because a majority of the research we do is funded by the government. So I think there needs to be sometimes a stronger connection between science and political decisions and regulations. So as scientists, we need to make sure that we are confident in our results and our messaging. So we use different methods to evaluate our level of uncertainty and our confidence. And some of these things are really simple, but we do it all the time. So for example, when you run an experiment, you replicate the groups within an experiment. And you even sometimes repeat an experiment to make sure you're getting the same result every single time. That's really important. We also measure the variability in our experiment. So when you are measuring the sample, how different are all the samples in one group? The more similar they are, the more confident you are in that result. So we report that variability, and it does impact our ability to make a solid conclusion about what we saw. So another thing we do, once we're confident in the results, our work is reviewed by other experts in the field, basically to call us out on our mistakes and to make sure that, you know, the science was done in a sound fashion, it was done properly, and that the conclusions we made make sense and match up with the results that we saw. So this is called the peer review process. So these are all safeguards in ensuring that our science is solid and presentable and what we found is the truth. Not to mention the 10 plus years of university level education that qualifies us to do this actual research. So once we're confident with the results, it's been peer reviewed. Generally, our research is published in a scientific journal, which is fine, but the public doesn't really read that or doesn't have access to it. And the messaging isn't distilled and condensed. And journalists and policymakers can't keep up with all of the specific research that's being published in a certain area. So generally the onus is on the scientists to communicate their results with the media and the public. And honestly, sometimes we don't always do this. So there's a few ways that I've experienced in doing this and communicating my research results. So for example, academic institutions like Dalhousie will liaise with the media and provide the messaging so that we can pitch a story to the media based on our latest results. And then sometimes that's what you see in the news. It's because the scientist has reached out in affiliation with the university to make that research known to the public. In terms of the policy front, recently I was invited as a delegate for an event called Science Meets Parliament. This is hosted by the Canadian Science Policy Centre and the Office of the Chief Science Advisor. And the purpose of this event is to help strengthen the connection between science and policy communities. So I look forward to that opportunity. And of course, I also use my own social media to talk about my latest research. I have Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn accounts, and when I have a new publication, I'll write a quick message, the take-home message, and put up the article. So if it wasn't the connection to the media, I think a lot of research does get buried in scientific journals, which, as I said, A, the public doesn't always have access to, and B, policymakers, regulators, and media journalists don't always have the time to go through it all. So, and I mean, obviously, sometimes when we're asked by the media and government, we're asked to comment on something specific. So they're reaching out to us to make a comment on something. But in general, the onus is on us to provide the messaging as widely as possible. And I do try to take this upon myself to make that connection of my research to the public, because I want to provide information about aquaculture that's true and scientific based, especially in areas where I see that the public may be misinformed. But one of the biggest hurdles against science is time. So if you think about all of the steps that we need to take to design our research, all of the safeguards that I talked about to make sure that it's rigorous, to evaluate the uncertainty so that we're confident in the results, this is a problem because this level of rigor requires a lot of time. And sometimes that might lead to jumping to conclusions, especially if an answer is needed right away. This can lead to controversy, and especially when the question is being asked by the public or the media and they need an answer right away. And kind of talked about the challenges of them. Scientists can better communicate our results, perhaps in a more timely fashion, while still being confident in the results and messaging. But also on the policy and media front, how the expectation for immediate solutions need to match what we're actually able to provide in a given timeline with confidence in our results. So just to kind of wrap up, scientists, we need to make sure that we're confident in our results and messaging, sometimes painfully so, to achieve that level of rigor. And this comes at the expense of time, but it is really important that we do get our message out there so that it can be used by society and in policy. So analysts speak, and those are my initial comments. So thanks, Catherine.
Great, that's terrific. Thanks, Stephanie. So our next panelist needs no introduction, but of course I'm going to introduce him anyway. Andre Picard is the health columnist at the Globe and Mail, where he's been for, I believe, since 1987. So if there's anyone who understands just how difficult it is to distill incredibly complex and technical information to a broad readership, it's our next guest, Andre Picard.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that very kind introduction. So I've been writing, as you heard, about health and science and news for a long time, about going on 40 years. And the last year I've been sort of a full-time COVID person, started writing about COVID in early January 2020. And unfortunately, we haven't stopped yet. But I'm not going to talk about COVID. I'm going to just say a few general words, and then I look forward to the question and answer period. I see some questions already coming in, which are interesting. So I thought I'd talk a bit about how scientists communicate scientists and the role of journalists in this. So journalists see themselves principally as translators. We take complex scientific issues and we make them comprehensible and digestible to the public. And we don't always translate well. There's no question about that. There's a whole broad range of quality and quantity of journalism. I think the challenge for people who do this, especially those who do it full time, is to make things simple without making them simplistic, without making them wrong. And that is a fine line often. We have space challenges, jargon challenges, etc. I personally don't believe the stereotype that scientists are bad communicators. I think a lot of journalists believe that. It's not true. I think, as in society more generally, some are very good, some are very bad communicators. It really depends. It's not because you have a PhD that you're a bad communicator. I think, too, that if you understand how the media works and how the public interprets what the media says. I think that makes you, as a scientist, a better communicator. So I really hope that scientists read a lot of media. I think that's really important. A lot of them don't. And if you understand how the sausage is made, it's not always the most pleasant thing to know, but it doesn't stop you from enjoying the sausage, I hope. So I don't know if that's the best analogy, but there you go. I should have used a fish and aquaculture analogy, but I didn't have one handy. I'd say my number one tip for scientists and physicians is don't speak to the public the way you speak to each other. You have a secret language, you have all these special words, you like to fight things out, you like uncertainty, nuance, debate, and that doesn't always serve you well in the public realm. The public often sees uncertainty as a lack of knowledge. So we tend to like people who are very certain, even those who shouldn't be, which is maybe not a good trait on our part. But I think it's important to avoid jargon. There's a lot of jargon in science that you have to leave at home when you talk to the public. I think you do have to be very careful about language. Words that have a specific scientific meaning can have a very different meaning in the public. A good example is pandemic. You know, the word technically means an outbreak of disease across a large geographic area. It's a pretty boring thing. But to the public, pandemic means we're all going to die really soon, you know, run for the hills. So you have to be careful when you use those words. And in this case, pandemic was appropriate, but we use that word often before this pandemic came along in inappropriate ways. I'd say the single most common question I get at panels like this and from scientists is, how do you pick your subject? You know, how do you pick who you choose to talk to, which scientist you quote? And of course, the unspoken part of that question is, why don't you pick me? Pick me. But we can't pick everyone. But I'll talk about that more in the question period if you want. But I think it's, you should know there's nothing really scientific about it. We pick who's most handy most of the time. We like the new part of the word news. You know, it is something you're talking about new. We depend a lot on research in medical and scientific journals, but as Stephanie said, we certainly don't cover the gamut. I read maybe 40 journals a week, but that's a fraction of what's published. So we depend on that because it's an easy way of vetting, giving us what's supposed to be new. We of course like stories that have a hook to them. You know, meaning the news is already out there and you build on it. If there's a political debate going on in Parliament about assisted dying, for example, you're going to get a lot more traction about your research on MAID if it happens to come out at that time, if it comes out another time when it's not top of the political agenda. So there's a lot of chance in there as well. Of course, we like controversy. We can't deny that. That's what most journalism is about. It's about differences of opinion, differences of views, settling scores. And, you know, the more stark, the better. We've had a great field day with that in COVID because there's a lot of disagreement on a lot of issues. This black and white view of the world, there's no question it can be problematic because in science, there's a lot of gray and there's a lot of nuance. And you know, I don't want to present too much of a caricature of the media because I think we're getting actually better at nuance in the media. You might not see that during COVID, but I think in general it's true. In fact, I'd say that science journalism today is better than it's ever been, which is good. The bad news is that at the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of crap that's getting much worse than ever. So you have to try and find, I think, be careful not to taint or to paint all media with the same brush. There's a real variety and there's some really excellent science journalism in particular. And I guess if I come back to that question, one of the questions was, you know, do we have media darlings? I saw that in the question and answer box already, and I was going to address that. Yes, absolutely we do. And who are they? Are they the most brilliant scientists? Probably not, but they're certainly the most available. Those with the best pithy quotes. That's what we look for, you know, people who can talk readily about subjects. Availability is really important. That's why we have way more physicians being quoted than nurses. Doctors are more flexible. For example, they have more freedom. There's all kinds of reasons that we pick people. Your PR departments, they were mentioned, they're important. They're your friends. They can help you facilitate that. But But I'll say the final thing I'll say, in the media, we're starting to finally think a lot more about representations. Whose voices do we amplify and why do we amplify them? And I think that's a really important discussion. It's a good thing. And it means we're looking for more women, more racialized scientists, et cetera. But it does make it more difficult because these are traditionally groups that are a little more reluctant, a little less arrogant, a little less available. So it makes the job a little more difficult, but I think it's an important thing. I think I'll stop there, and I'll just welcome any questions and comments during the question period. Thanks.
Wonderful. Lots to think about there. Thank you so much, Andre. And again, we had a question about the media darlings who are often asked to comment on events regardless of their area of specific research or peer-reviewed publications. And I just find this interesting because I just discovered last week, in fact, that there is actually a name for people like that, which is ultra crepidarians. So if you want to talk about ultra crepidarians later on, then we can open it up and discuss that. Now, Bernie Miller, our final panelist, is Deputy Minister in the Office of Strategy Management and has also served as Deputy Minister in the Department of Business and Office of Planning and Priorities, as well as serving as Senior Executive Advisor in the province's Executive Council Office. So what's the view from inside government?
Thanks a lot, Catherine. And that is the perspective I'm going to try to bring to the question from a policymaker's perspective in the context of COVID-19. How do we actually receive information? How do we apply it? So I'm going to break it into really three phases. The early phase, and just tell you a little bit about my week in March 9th to 13th, 2020, but then hopefully more interestingly, talk about flattening the curve, which was all about acquiring knowledge. And during that acquiring knowledge phase, how did that happen and how could it be improved? I'm going to make a distinction between biomedical knowledge and social knowledge. And then I just want to close with after action reviews and how we can make the system work more effectively and collaboratively, and then some advice from the point of view of policymakers. So as you mentioned, I'm a deputy minister in government. My background is not in the natural sciences. I didn't even take health science for poets and philosophers. My background was law for about 25 years before I joined government, and political science in my university education. So in that way, I may be typical of some of the policymakers that are involved in the decision-making interface that Lisa spoke about. So in the early phase, how did I receive information and how did I apply it? Well, until March 9th, I've obviously was reasonably informed person and was aware of the European situation with COVID-19. It wasn't called COVID-19 at that particular point in time, the coronavirus. It was distant and it was not something that we felt an immediate urgency on. And March 9th was a Monday morning. Typically on Monday mornings, the deputy ministers from across government have a face-to-face meeting. That is a pretty normal meeting. We have a normal agenda that we go through, but something wasn't normal on March 9th in that the agenda was scrapped and the full meeting was going to be dedicated to informing us all about the status of coronavirus and what the future may hold. So at that stage, we're inferring information from what we're hearing. And during the course of that, one of the senior people from Department of Health, after somewhat alarming information, said that said, this weekend I'm going to Toronto. I may take in a play, I may go see Hamilton. So as a policymaker, I inferred from that well, it's not happening this week. Then later that day, we had the regular meeting of the Council of Nova Scotia University Presidents. So in Nova Scotia, all 9 university presidents meet with government officials from time to time. We happen to have one scheduled on the 9th. And in that conversation, obviously coronavirus had been brought up in the early phase before we did the roundtable. And the extent of the conversation was, I wonder if convocations are going to be adversely affected by it. So here I am as a policymaker with political science and law. There's lots of PhDs around that table. And I'm hearing is convocations, typically May, June, likely to be affected. Not that I'm expressly acknowledging this, but in my processing of information, that's what I'm hearing. But in the course of that week, everything changed. And by the 13th, the urgency of the matter had become quite significant. So that was when the real need to acquire information fast really kicked in. And that really gets to the second phase, the flattening the curve. Understanding exponential growth and the risk of exponential growth, and the objective of the early phase was to slow the rate of transmission. Then we needed information, and we needed it fast, as Lisa pointed out. The pace and precision, in my view, actually probably depends on what discipline you're talking about. You need both specialist information and you need interdisciplinary information. When it comes to the biomedical research, I think we were well served by a very quick acknowledgement of how little we actually knew. And that helped us as policymakers understand that we needed to buy time to get more knowledge. So the biomedical research, the biomedical information is very precautionary and very important to be precise. And I learned very quickly that the science and the epidemiology specialists that I were dealing with had a really ingrained sense of caution. They were not what I would put in any category of risk takers when it came to technology and innovation. That was not something people wanted to talk about. That's something that maybe should be talked about before the crisis, but not during the crisis. And we might want to think of that in the context of the climate change crisis as well. But it was very much a case of just learning rapidly and learning how biomedical researchers thought and getting a sense of their level of concern and their level of caution. However, I do draw a distinction from the biomedical side of it, or the natural sciences, to the social sciences, where from a policymaker's point of view, more rapid and even imprecise, but the best information we have available at the time would have been useful. And I do recall there was a professor from University of Toronto, Joshua Gans, who is an economist, and while he was in self-isolation, he produced a fairly significant textbook, obviously no time to have it peer reviewed, but based on his knowledge of the discipline and his own perspectives and information, put out a book, Economics in the Time of COVID. And I do recall reading that in April, knowing that it wasn't precise, but it was certainly going to be helpful for my decision-making, especially as Department of Business. I thought back to the Foundation of Economics and Adam Smith and the theory of moral sentiments, where before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he said, "The wise and virtuous man is at all times willing that his own private interest should be sacrificial to the public interest should circumstances so demand." And I think one of the things that was missing in the conversation was that good public health is good economics. And it very quickly got framed as a trade-off. And I think the economics profession could have been quicker off the mark to establish the view that there was no trade-off. Protecting people would be protecting the economy. And I think there would have been, and we're still suffering from that in the sense that the voices of the business community more broadly probably drowned out the economists that could bring a multidisciplinary and more academic view of the question that would have perhaps been beneficial. So we did adopt the view in Nova Scotia that there was no trade-off and that good public health would be good economics and good for business. And our employment levels in Nova Scotia are within 0.4% of what they were before the pandemic hit. by far the best employment performance in the country. So I think there was something to that position. So the third phase I really wanted to touch on quickly is the after action review. And I know federally, the Auditor General has just released a report, and the Auditor General felt it's important because a well-planned and informed public health response is crucial to limiting the spread and public health impact of an infectious disease during a pandemic. So this is actually probably a very predictable pattern that we will see. Auditors general from across the country will do analysis, and they'll come to the conclusion that people weren't sufficiently prepared, and the next time they should be more prepared. I frankly don't think that's useful. I also have read the World Economic Forum Global Risk Monitor from 2015 to 2020, and only once did the World Economic Forum identify pandemic as a global risk. They had a lot of risks that they identified: financial crises, credit crunch, climate change, et cetera. But only once in 5 years did the World Economic Forum identify a pandemic. So the kind of predictable path of Auditor General report, media coverage, which will say Auditor General slams response of province A, province B, province C, and then that will kind of go in. No individual will ultimately be accountable for that. It'll be system didn't work. So my suggestion from the after action review would be skip that stage and let's get to a more collaborative, productive analysis of systems change that would avoid that outcome. So just to wrap up, the advice I would synthesize just from the point of view of a policymaker, and this has been just reinforcement for what we heard from Lisa and Stephanie, is getting real-time useful data and analysis into the hands of decision makers is important. That means we need to build better processes for linking and applying. The pattern of just putting it out there and expecting that somehow it's going to get into the policymaking process doesn't work in pandemic time or in COVID time. We need a more defined process. Communicating through multiple channels, communicating honestly and effectively, and acknowledging the uncertainty. And when that uncertainty is acknowledged, I think it's important that in the disciplines that you're in, that people collectively acknowledge the uncertainty, because as Andre pointed out, media loves controversy, and if scientist A is saying X and scientist B is saying Y, that becomes a story and it confuses the public. The final point would be recognize the different receptor capacity of policymakers, and this somewhat goes to Andre's point about communicating publicly. The same for policymakers. Consider policymakers on a spectrum. Think of Dr. Anthony Fauci and the monumental task that he had. I compare it to explaining advanced calculus to a Cocker Spaniel. So that's one end of the spectrum of receptor capacity. The others would be people with no scientific background, and then of course the specialists, and you need to communicate probably to the latter two. Hopefully we won't have another Cocker Spaniel leading a nation, but with that, I will turn it back over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much. So we've got some really wonderful insight in the panel, and we've got some questions lined up. And if you do have some questions, please add them into our question and answer bar. I read a quote recently that being able to live with a residue of uncertainty rather than constructing an illusion of certainty is the lifeblood of an informed society. But on the other hand, the public, and we noticed that right at the beginning of the pandemic, that the public generally wants some reassurance that those in charge actually know what's going on and know what to do about it. So I'm going to ask the panel, I'm just going to throw this one out there. Do you think that the recognition of uncertainty strengthens or undermines public trust? And I'm going to hand this over first to Andre, because we have somebody who wants you to talk about the challenges with communicating uncertainty. So Andre.
Yeah, so I think there's no question it's difficult to communicate uncertainty. I'm a big fan of there's a risk communication guru, Peter Sandman, and he talks about this a lot. And I follow him religiously. And he talks about he's researched this very deeply. And he says, the public, it's true, public wants to be assured, but they want to be reassured, but they don't want to be over reassured. They don't want to be lied to. There's a real reluctance to acknowledge uncertainty among politicians and policymakers. But Sandman finds, he says, one of the things people like is when people say, I don't know, because it just makes them feel more human. So people don't know a lot of stuff. So that's actually not a bad thing. And it's really difficult for politicians, especially, to say that. But it's important to say it. We don't know. It's up in the air. So I think that uncertainty is difficult, but it's not impossible to communicate. And you have to, I think it involves a little bit of nuance, and we don't do that great in the media, but we can work at it, and we can do it better if you communicate nuance. It'll be transmitted, I think, in the media in a more nuanced way.
Good thoughts, Lisa?
Yeah, it's tough. I have heard the word risk around every time I've gone to open my mouth more from people who were worried during this pandemic than I care to think about, to be honest. And I follow the same person. I've looked at risk and communication, but I will say I am a huge fan of of presenting. Allowing sounds fairly paternalistic, but we have to allow, right? If we are the holders of information and data and knowledge, we need to be able to explain to people things in a very transparent way. And I think uncertainty is part of that. A great example would be even this week, where information has come to light around one of our vaccines that are available in Canada. And we've needed to change the messaging around who gets it when for a certain period of time. There were a lot of people, and there still are, who think that that's too much information for people. They can't figure it out. They will lose confidence in a process. Perhaps that's true, but I do think the other piece here around how you communicate has to do with relationships and trust. And part of that does come to who is saying something, but how they say it as well. So I think risk, uncertainty, I'm a big fan of honestly putting it out there for people and allowing context and conversation. I don't think that necessarily negates confidence or changes people's perception that something is good or bad information, but it does need to be done in the context of relationships. And quite honestly, in this day and age, most of those relationships do come through media for people. And I think honestly, there's been a lot of good work done by media in Canada in particular of striking some balance and providing different context for the most part. So transparency, context, I like risk and uncertainty. And I think if you've got a relationship with people or build it, they will respond to it.
Wonderful. Okay. Bernie, we've got a really interesting question here from Sarah Allen at the North American Observatory. And she notes that the perspective that good health is good for the economy, which was adopted in Nova Scotia and the other Atlantic provinces, was quite different than the message that other provinces had outside the Atlantic region. And she asked, given the mechanisms for pan-Canadian collaboration, such as meetings of deputy ministers and various committees, to what extent were you able to share or to discuss this particular view, and also the concomitant false trade-off of public health and versus the economy with your counterparts across the country?
So that's a great question, and the honest answer is very little opportunity as the pandemic occurred. And partly it started in the West and worked its way east, which gave us an opportunity and advantage to, despite what I said about the week of March 9th, we were able to learn quickly from other provinces rather than the other way around. They couldn't learn from us. Had it started in the East, it might have gone the other way. So that's kind of at one point. Two, the venues for doing that, we were well into it before there were FPT, federal, provincial, territorial meetings. So the horse was out of the barn, so to speak. And the final piece, quite candidly, in the Canadian Federation, Nova Scotia is not a province that is treated as if we've got a lot of economic heft historically. So our position on it wouldn't at the outset have really resonated very much in my humble assessment. It may be in the after action reviews, and when people look at why did some jurisdictions have success and others didn't, they may come to conclusions based on a whole range of factors, including that we had a very good ongoing communication with the business community, which I would emphasize in after action review, having we had daily meetings with 200 business associations from across the province, and that to me in many ways was one of the things that set Nova Scotia apart, because we could communicate from Dr. Strang to our senior officials to everybody that needed information in real time. And I think that when we look at it will be one of the things. But as far as the national situation, there just wasn't a venue, and the timing didn't permit it.
Very interesting. Thanks. Stephanie, now you work in an area that is also incredibly politicized, from the harvesting of lobsters, which has been in the news recently. Farmed salmon, again, in their own time, have been in the spotlight. How is it possible, or is it possible, to communicate technical information to the public without being seen to take sides?
That is difficult, and it's a balance. And sometimes the evidence does point to a side. Sometimes it shows that there is a clear message, and it may be showing that one side is incorrect, or there was some mixed messaging there. So I don't think it's necessarily that you need to take a side, for example, but you do need to have a balanced conversation. And you do need to provide a message that is very clear so that it's understood by all sides. And in terms of conveying that uncertainty, sometimes it's very clear what the evidence is, and sometimes it's a little more muddy. And I think that's, going back to what you said about sides, I think that's kind of the beauty of being confident in scientific evidence, especially if the evidence has been piling over years and many studies, because you're very confident in that. And you can provide a very clear-cut answer to some of these controversies, whether it be, impacts of farmed salmon, or the impacts of the lobster fishery, or whatever it may be. If you give it time, science will gain greater and greater confidence, so that you know the answer and you can provide that.
Right. Very good answer. I see that David Zettner wants to ask a question about vaccines. So Lisa, you'd like to take the bull by the horns here. David writes, yearly flu immunization remains contentious. Wouldn't it help mediate differences if the public received more information about the overall long-term health and sickness of regular flu shot acceptors and rejectors? He adds, flu vaccine is an important program. Why is it difficult to find information about overall long-term health and sickness of acceptors and rejectors?
Well, I'm glad he asked the question. There is lots of information out there on that exact issue. It's not always easy to find. For a lot of people, I think that would be really helpful information. For folks who have the most challenge, or who are most likely to not get a flu shot, I think it's not just getting the data, like you've just mentioned, about who gets sick and who doesn't. It's actually adding in a whole lot of other information about human behavior that data doesn't just support. So it's presenting that information in a way that folks need to hear it or want to hear it. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is there is a whole field out there on vaccine confidence and or hesitancy. And a lot of the issues around hesitancy or confidence don't just come from facts. It's understanding what exactly it is in individual people that make them likely or unlikely to do something. For example, I know I should probably be walking more than 267 steps every day right now, but I'm not. You can give me information all you want, that tells me that I should be doing that to prevent my heart disease risk and keep this over tall frame from getting stiff and old fast, but I won't do it because I need a different motivator. And so your point's well taken. For those who want that information, we should be providing it in very, very public places. It is available, but it's hidden, you're right. And people see some risk to it. Sometimes that's the problem. But the other part of that is that we don't just need to look to people to give them information. We need to look to find out what their challenges are, not just around vaccines, but many other health related things, and put it in their context. So I think that's a great point, and a really, really key part, and I'm going to pull this back in because it's a bit of an elephant for me around the pandemic, is that, and health in general, is we have health protection units. That's how part of our public health happens, health protection units. And that can be pretty maternal, paternal, paternalistic very quickly. And it takes power away from people sometimes. So we need to be able to go back and start asking people, Canadians and other humans, what they need to facilitate their health, not just tell them pieces of information in one way all the time. And I think that that's, we didn't necessarily do that super well with the pandemic. I don't think we've engaged people properly around testing, around vaccines. And if we don't start partnering with people better and well, outside of protection model, but a true partnership model, we're going to see some continued and worsening outcomes very quickly. So I'd love to hear what other people think, but we haven't used policy to help that out at the federal, provincial level either.
And this was also an issue with the H1N1 pandemic as well, as I recall. But the interesting difference, one interesting difference between COVID and H1N1 is that now we have an incredibly well-developed social media machine, which we didn't have back then. So, Andre, with a nod to Marshall McLuhan here, do you think that the way in which information is diffused these days through social media is making us more distrustful about the scientific information we read about? I mean, is your readership now more cynical about what they read in the media? Or is a platform allowing smaller players to have a voice, providing a useful balance to the increased centralization of the traditional media?
Yeah, I think the short answer to your question is yes. Yes to all those things. But yeah, I think the social media is, it's this experiment on a grand scale. It's changing every day. I think we're at the beginning of figuring out how it's affecting our world. We thought initially I think we were very starry-eyed about social media. It was going to democratize society and be wonderful. And I think it's quite the opposite. It's been used to perpetuate nonsense and, undermine democracy on a grand scale. So I think we really have to rethink this. So has it undermined the so-called legacy media? Absolutely. But it's far more than the media. It's undermined trust in society generally, in all institutions. So I think we have to, it's a real challenge. We have to learn how to communicate very differently in the 21st century. And to come back to what Lisa said, I think the group that has to change most urgently is public health. Public health has this tradition of communicating like from the pulpit, like they're a religion. They tell people what to do and, this is the word of God and do it. And that's that. There's no conversation. So I think that the conversation's good on social media, but too many people are being left out of it. And a lot of scientists are being left out of it. The other problem with social media is it's very, we're in little bubbles, right? We speak in our little groups and there's not a lot of interaction. So it's a strange new world out there. And I think we're just at the very beginning of learning how to adapt to it.
Mm-hmm. There's, I think, Stephanie, you mentioned as well that academics have to work harder to try to communicate the results to the broader public. But what about communicating academic results to governments? Stephanie, do you have the sense that there is an efficient uptake of academic research into policymaking circles?
I think that is not an easy thing to do, and I think it does present an opportunity to have more of a conversation. And in my experience now, there is a conversation, for example, between the aquaculture community and Department of Fisheries and Oceans, for example, or Department of Fisheries and Aquaculture here in Nova Scotia. So there is a conversation. And of course, you know, DFO, DFA, they have their own scientists doing the work. So the academics and the scientists within government don't always necessarily speak, but when they do, I think there's a huge opportunity, because we do research a little bit differently. Not in the basic methodological sense, but academia is just different than government. And so, you know, there's some other larger projects that are informing DFO, for example. At Dalhousie, we're part of the Ocean Frontier Institute, and we're working on a paper right now that's exactly for that purpose, is writing to specifically DFO about the blue economy and the opportunity that it presents, and the results that the Ocean Frontier Institute that have been developed over the past 5 years. And so if we didn't come up with this kind of white paper idea to present that to DFO, the results of the Ocean Frontier Institute may stay within scientific communities instead of informing policy. So again, like, I think the onus is on academic scientists to provide the results in whatever opportunity may present itself in. For example, this blue economy or the Science Meets Parliament event that I've been invited to. These opportunities do come up. So I think it's important that academic scientists, take advantage of that.
Bernie, I'm going to ask you the flip side of that question. How do governments tend to use academic information? How do deputy ministers, for example, keep up to date on the new academic research coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I think the short answer is not well enough. And part of it is, as Stephanie just said, we need to come up with new ways to interact with each other. Like everyone, there's never enough time to do all the things you want to do. And in the senior leadership of a department in government, as much as time and reflection, I'm impressed that Andre can read 40 journal articles a week. We don't necessarily have that opportunity. We have a senior policy staff that can do it. The thing that struck me, despite my earlier response to Sarah, I thought federalism worked really well in the early phase of the pandemic because all the old rules didn't apply, and we just had to come up with new ways. And certainly as far as getting financial responses to preserve the well-being of people, there was new and rapid ways of doing that. And what I'd like to see as part of the after action review of this particular crisis is we don't go back to business as usual. We don't do things the way we've always done them. We find new and better ways. And I think that means that it's about introspection in our own communities, and then coming forward not with predictable or critical of the other side of the conversation, but how can you change your system to adapt to other systems? So we have the academic and research system, we have the government system, we have many systems, and I think the task for the future is to get those systems to interact more effectively. And part of that is reviving community, and really being very knowledgeable that there's the state, there's the economy, and then there's community, and how do we breathe life back into community so we can interact better.
It's going to be very interesting to see what the aftermath of the pandemic brings. One final very quick question, Lisa. There's a joke that we're all armchair epidemiologists now. But to what extent do you think that COVID has actually made us more intelligent consumers of scientific information? Better understanding of absolute versus relative risk, how data is collected in clinical trials, and so on and so forth?
You know, I think that people have absorbed an incredible amount of information, to be honest, and they've done it really well, which is always my argument when I get the risk comment. I'm like, Canadians are smart. If we do this well, they will absorb information. And And I think the other, I'll toss this in here, the thing that has worked fairly well, I think, in Atlantic Canada is we did try and generate an ownership of this pandemic within the community by engaging community differently, not just business, but actually making them a part of that response. That works really well. I mean, I answer questions on different programs and things from across Canada, and the questions are great, recognizing that's a subset of people, not the general population. But I think that everyone across the board, through the necessity, has gotten an awful lot of information and gotten it right and well. And if we continue to help people learn about these things and hear what they want to know, more importantly, as opposed to presuming, we're going to get a very, very qualified group of people with a whole lot more engagement. The silver lining for me is seeing this engagement across Canada in health and health knowledge and the information that goes into it. So I think people have learned a ton, and I love the armchair epidemiologists because we can help each other learn. I can learn what they need to know, and they can get that information out to other people. So I think it's been a great process, a little Pollyannish.
Well, I think it's a very positive note to wrap up on. I'd like to thank all of our participants today for their very thoughtful comments, as well as those who logged in to ask questions. Just a reminder that this webinar will also be available on the McEachern Institute's Facebook page and YouTube channel. So thanks again to Lisa Barrett, Stephanie Colombo, Andre Picard, and Bernie Miller. And do check out the resources on the McEachern Institute website. Bye now.